Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready hot, fresh, and fast. Whether it's lunch on the go, dinner with friends, or a full-on fiesta at home, Cafe Rio always brings the flavor and the fun. So what are you waiting for? We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again. I come at you a little late. Didn't get you an episode earlier this week. I apologize for that. Had a little bit of a different plan than was expected. It was expected, but not quite the same. My family, my wife's family, they're diehard Chiefs fans, and they decided they wanted to do a family vacation during the season to go watch a Chiefs game. So we went to a Monday night football game so I could go cover the game Saturday for the Utes and then fly out Sunday morning to meet them. And I was hoping to do a podcast earlier in the week to recap the Colorado and all the other kind of stuff related to that. And just unfortunately, it didn't work. Ended up having to give up my seat on Tuesday when I was flying home to some other people and had to stay an extra day and all that jazz. So, yeah, you know, it's fun, but we're happy to be back, right? But as part of that, I do not have a special guest today. Sorry if you're looking forward to that. It's just going to be me. So brace for that. But yeah, crazy week. Wasn't able to do exactly what I wanted to, the way that I wanted to. And, you know, we're going to roll with it, though. But that's it. We got some fun stuff to talk about this episode. So, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about Big 12 title game possibilities for Utah. My fancy little flow chart is back for the season. It's college football season, so we get the flow chart season. Last year you didn't get that because Utah wasn't even in consideration for the championship game. So we're back. We're going to preview some of the options for Utah and kind of what's there, and jump into that. We'll talk a little QB controversy, maybe, and then we're going to preview the game. Obviously, it's a big game this weekend, and we'll talk about what that means for the Utes as well as their potential in the Big 12 Conference Championship game. So we'll jump into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners, Cafe Rio. Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have them ready, hot, fresh, and fast. We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com. All right, let's jump into this. It's Big 12 title game possibilities flowchart season. So if you've followed me on Twitter over the years, you may know that I've been known to do these flowcharts for championship game possibilities. I've done them in the Pac-12 days, different things that way. It really started because I wanted to try to see how, what the chances of Utah's, of getting to the championship game. If I remember right, and I'd have to go back and look at all this, but if I remember right, this kind of came as a result of the championship year where Utah needed like 4 different things to go its way to be able to make the title game. I think I actually started before that, the week before that or something like that. And so it's just kind of a way for me to pair what I do writing and in my research to kind of see how these things go, and then giving you as a fan an idea of how this goes, right? I felt the flowchart was the easiest way just simply because there's a lot of different things to digest, right? And it's based off different scenarios or outcomes. And so this felt like the best approach to do that. And over the years, it's just kind of been a fun little way to re-up. And I built these graphics by hand over the years, made them as a photo. But this year, I've decided to use a tool that has been much more effective that you can utilize. So I've got it posted on my latest article that it was published on Thursday, talking about Utah's game ahead with Cincinnati. I also tweeted a link to it, so you can go check it out there. My goal here is to update this weekly as those odds change and as things go on. So, depending on how things go for Utah, I'll continue to update that if Utah loses, that there's not really a reason to update it. But we'll continue to follow that and try to give you some updates there. But what I'm getting at here is that Utah does have a chance at a Big 12 title appearance. Now, if you would have asked me that about a week ago, those odds were much more difficult and stacked against Utah. And so the first domino of sorts fell last week when Arizona State lost. Arizona State had a lot of the cards. They were in the driver's seat of sorts, even though there's other teams that were there ahead of them. But because of their win over Texas Tech, that afforded them some great grace in what they were able to do. But the problem was they had to win out the rest of the way for it to really work. And so the fact that Arizona State lost last week gives Utah much higher odds now to get back into the championship game. So it's not perfect. Utah doesn't control its own destiny. And so there's still things that Utah has to rely on to make it work, but it's far more likely than, and I don't want to say far more likely, but the chances of it being more likely are higher, right? There's still other games that factor into this, and, depending on how some of those outcomes go, that will give Utah higher odds. But, that's kind of where it's at right now. And it essentially boils down to a 5-team race. There are 3 other teams that have an outside chance, but it's much more difficult. And so what those teams are is BYU and Cincinnati both have a 5-0 record in conference play. So they're in the driver's seat, essentially. These two teams, well, kind of, because either one of these teams, if they win out, they're in, right? Like that's clear. But they do play each other. So one of these teams has to lose, and they could still play each other in the championship game. But one of them has, the true driver's seat because they can win out. They both can, but you get what I'm trying to say there. And so you've got those two teams that are undefeated where a little bit more chaos has to happen for them to miss out on a Big 12 title championship game, but it is possible. And, there's scenarios that aren't unlikely that could put either one or both of these teams outside of the championship. So still a lot of games to be played, 4 games exactly for all of the teams over a 5-week period. And so there's still a lot of chaos that's going on, and that's what makes this a little bit more challenging. So you've got those two teams that are undefeated in conference play. And then you've got Houston and Texas Tech, who are both 4-1. And then clearly Utah at 3-2. And I'm not just including Utah in there at 3-2 just because I cover Utah. Granted, the flow chart is based around Utah, so that's why it's there. But Utah is legit one of those 5-team contenders. They don't own their own path, but at the same time, they're in the mix. Unlike Arizona State, Kansas State, and TCU, who are also 3-2 in conference play, but based on the way the tiebreakers fall, essentially any one of those 5 teams would be preferred over any of those 3. So kind of a tough spot for ASU, Kansas State, and TCU, but there's still a chance. It's an outsider's chance with them, but a lot more chaos would have to happen for them to get into a championship game. So I'm not going to get into all that. There's just way too many possibilities there. If I was smarter at creating things on the computer, I would put all these scenarios in there and have it kind of filter through all this and do it for me. Maybe next year. I'm getting closer to that, trying to get stuff like that, but not today. So this is essentially the 5 teams. Like I said, it's a 5-team race with 2 of those teams that has, the driver's seat. The rest of the teams, there's still things that have to happen to be done, but a fair amount of teams that are in contention. And so looking at this, as I've gone through it, there could be more options. This is the options that I've found. I'm fairly confident that I've got most of it all settled. I used a resource, and now I'm blanking. I don't have it with me right here, but I have a resource that I tweeted about that helps me kind of see this in a better form so that I can not have to do pen and paper quite fully. Usually that's how I had to do it and play out all the scenarios. And of course I'd miss some and cause some problems. So, it happens. There's human error involved there. And there may be potential where some things are broken or wrong and it doesn't play out the exact same way. But we'll continue to update it and do whatever. That's a lot to say. There's a few options available for Utah. And at least 8 scenarios will get Utah into a championship game. So that's kind of where it is. Pretty good odds that it can happen if things happen the way that they need to. That sounds funny, but I think there's a decent chance in a lot of these. So looking at this real quick before I go through some of the scenarios, and the reason why I say there's a decent chance is because a lot of these teams have to play each other or play tough games. So, for example, BYU still has to play Texas Tech, Cincinnati. They also have to play TCU. They do end with UCF, but we're going to assume that they beat UCF. I mean, it's the very last game of the season, so you can't fully guarantee it based on how things have gone before, and you may just drop a game that you don't intend to, but that's kind of where it's at. Cincinnati obviously is coming to Utah this week. Then they have a bye. They play Arizona, which is kind of a toss-up game. Arizona has shown that it can be good, but they can also be not so good. And then they have to play BYU and TCU to close out. So Cincinnati's got a tough path as well. That's why I assume one or both of these teams aren't going to win out. They could, and obviously if they win out, there's no reason they shouldn't be in the championship game because they clearly are the best team and have that path there. But I think both of these teams most likely have at least one loss, and so that opens the door for a lot of different variables in this. Looking at Houston and Texas Tech. So Houston, they play West Virginia and at UCF, so 2 games that you would assume that they win. But then they close out with a bye and then against TCU and Baylor. Now, both of those teams have not been great, but at the same time, they're kind of they are in-state rivalries. They're games that are going to mean a lot, and so it's not always a guarantee that you can get those games. So really fascinated to kind of see Houston's direction, but I would say their path is probably one of the easier ones just because of who they play, but you can get tripped up anytime, and TCU and Baylor especially are going to be tough. Texas Tech, this is a team that obviously looked to be kind of the inevitable team that they were going to appear in the Big 12 title game, but their path isn't easy, and it starts this week at Kansas State. And for those that have watched Kansas State, that may not seem like a difficult game, but this is a game that just Kansas State has their number every single year. I saw a stat, and I don't have it right with me. I should have put it there. But I think they've won once over the last, I don't even know how long. So it's not been great for Texas Tech. Obviously a far different team this year for both of these teams. But Kansas State has had the upper hand in this game, and you have to wonder if going to Kansas State is going to present some problems for Texas Tech. If that happens, that opens this thing wide up for a lot of teams to be able to be in there. So you got that. Then they have to play BYU next week at home. They also play UCF and West Virginia. So you have to imagine those last 2 games of the season are going to be pretty, I don't want to call it easy, but they should be winnable games. So the real test for Texas Tech comes in these next 2 weeks. Kansas State and BYU go unscathed through that, and they're in the championship game. And so, easy path-ish for them, but they do have to go against tough teams, and that BYU game especially is going to have big ramifications on what takes place in the Big 12 title game. For Utah, they obviously play Cincinnati, have a bye, then they go on the road to play Baylor, come home to play Kansas State, and then go back out on the road to finish the season at Kansas. All of those can be tough games, and so there's no real easy path for Utah there, but they're also winnable games, right? They're games that Utah should most likely be favored in. Utah is favored in the Cincinnati game, which is the toughest game left on the schedule on paper, but there's no guarantees there. And all it takes is one, and things get messed up. So that's kind of the lay of the land. Let's look at some of the options and how it would work for Utah. Essentially, well, not essentially, this is the only way it really happens, and that is that Utah has to win out. So if Utah drops a game in any of their last 4, the deal is essentially over. You could somehow get there with 3 losses, though I don't really know how, because I don't think there's enough games for other teams to lose ahead of you that would make it possible. So it essentially, you have to believe that everything here rides on Utah winning out. And so if they win out, look, you've got a chance. If you lose a game, settle for whatever bowl game you get, hope that you can have, a 9-3 season, whatever that may be, hope that things can not go too south. You've already qualified for a bowl. You're going to probably have opt-outs. You'll have those types of things. It's more just trying to get, the appearance that you're a better team than you were last year, which you already are because you've won 6 games and you're bowl eligible, but it's not going to be the Big 12 title game opportunity that you thought it was. So, Utah's backs are against the wall essentially, and if they want to be able to do what they dreamed of or had a goal of this year, these last 4 games are going to be pivotal. So regardless of what these other teams do, Utah has to take care of its own business first. So looking at some of the interesting options, and there's an option where Utah can play any one of these 4 teams. And so I'm going to go through an option for each of these games. So for example, for a Texas Tech and Utah rematch in the Big 12 title game, Texas Tech would have to win out. BYU would have to lose to Cincinnati. They'd already lose to Texas Tech as a result of that because Texas Tech won out. And then Cincinnati would also have to lose the second game, and Houston would have to lose just 1 game. So, that's kind of how loses another game. Houston has already lost a game, so they would have to lose a second game, giving Utah the tiebreaker. That sounds kind of confusing sometimes, but that would put Texas Tech and Utah in the championship game together. There's another scenario there. There's actually a few where these 2 teams can come, but another one that is maybe a little bit more likely is Texas Tech wins out. BYU suffers a second loss in a different game. Doesn't have to be Cincinnati. It could be somebody else. And then Houston loses a game. So you still have that potential there where, that's an option. And, we'll see there. For a BYU-Utah rivalry matchup, which would be pretty wild, that would be crazy. Imagine the stakes now with a playoff spot on the line in this game. So that would be entertaining, doing it in Texas. Whatever. For that to happen, and this isn't so out of the ordinary that it couldn't be possible, Texas Tech would have to lose a game. So that could be Kansas State. That could be BYU, definitely in the realm of possibility. Then BYU wins out, which is a possibility. And then Houston loses just 1 game. So that's not that unlikely, right? And so the chances of a BYU-Utah rematch in a championship game would be pretty epic and entertaining, and it's one of the more likely chances. Then there's Houston versus Utah. So Texas Tech would have to lose a game. BYU would have to lose 2 games. Cincinnati has to lose a second game, and Houston wins out. So essentially, you've got a lot of teams that are doing... They have to lose twice, right? You're assuming that Cincinnati loses once to Utah because they've won out. And so they just need to lose a second game. BYU would have to lose a second game somewhere along the lines, and that's not guaranteeing... That's not easy, right? It could be against Texas Tech. It could be against Cincinnati. It could be anything. It could be that UCF game, for heaven's sake. So it could be anything, but the chances of that, I don't want to say they're not likely. They are. Not likely, but they're possible. But this one seems a little bit more drastic, though Houston could definitely win out. Then there is Cincinnati versus Utah. One of the scenarios there is Texas Tech loses a game, BYU loses 2 games, Cincinnati wins out after Utah, so they lose this week and then win out, and then Houston loses a game. So all of these are pretty realistic possibilities that could happen. We'll see what happens. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's kind of a fun little exercise to play around with and see what happens. But there's a lot on the table here. As I mentioned, if Utah doesn't win out, there's no real hope. And so you kind of have to have that as the benchmark there. If that doesn't happen, the rest of this goes out the window. You're looking at one of those 4 other teams, if not maybe another, team sneaking in there as a potential contender, but it would most likely be one of those 4 teams. And so, BYU and Texas Tech coming into the season were teams that clearly people could have seen being in the title game. But Cincinnati and Houston, 2 teams that are the second, or this is their third year in the power level, now contending for a potential spot in the championship game is pretty impressive. So, fun drama to be had in the last 5 weeks of the season. And this picture will obviously get clearer this week, as it will every single week of the season. But this week will be a big one. So there's that. Like I said, I'll update this throughout the weeks and see what happens. But it is imperative that Utah wins. Now let's jump over to some QB controversy. Now this one is interesting to me because we'll start with Kyle Whittingham talking about that there is no QB controversy on Monday. That is obvious, right? Devin Dampier is the guy. They're not forcing him to look over his shoulder and say that Bird Ficklin is the guy, and you've got to go out there and perform. Now, granted, Devin still has to go out there and perform, but this is not one of those things where they're trying to manufacture a controversy. Now, if it happens naturally, sure, that's the nature of it, but they're not trying to manufacture that. Whittingham said on Monday, he said, if a 90% Dampier is better than 100% Ficklin, he'll play Saturday. Meaning if they feel like he is better as a player at 90% than Bird is at 100%, then he'll play. That's not, we believe that 90% Dampier is better than 100% Ficklin. That's not what it is. It's based on his health, right? And if he's okay. If they feel like a 90% Dampier is better than 100% Ficklin, then they'll do that. So they're going to try to go with whoever, gives them the best chances to win. I know people hear that and they think it's just kind of crazy, but that's just how they feel. So, Bird or Devin Dampier was not involved, or he was not named on the initial availability report for this week, which would indicate that, there's a chance that he's going to play. I don't want to say it guarantees that he's starting, but it guarantees that he is available. Now, there's been, Brett McMurphy wrote a story about all this controversy and availability reports, and I'm not going to get into that because it's an availability report. It's not an injury report. And so at the end of the day, Devin Dampier, I said I'm not going to get into it, but I'm going to give you a little thing. Devin Dampier was available, right? He was the emergency quarterback. Bird Ficklin was the starter for that game, but if they needed to, they felt like they could put Devin Dampier in there. The reason he's not on that final availability report as out is because if you're on that as an out designation, there's no chance that you can play on Saturday. And so they left him off of that knowing that he wasn't going to play, but he was going to be available. And so that's just kind of the nature of that. You've got some of that. He was on the report during the week indicating that he was injured. They're not, I'm not here to shill for Utah by any means, but this is just simple explanation on how it works. He was on the list indicating that he was injured, right? Questionable, doubtful, whatever you want to put him at. But by the time it was game time, he was available if they needed him. You may see something similar this week with Bird Ficklin starting and Devin Dampier available. This early on in the week, it's Thursday, so it's not super early, but I'm going to lean that Dampier is the starter on Saturday, but that's still not 100% set. And so we'll see what happens. But if there is a scenario where Dampier is on the sidelines, it wasn't because Utah's trying to game things. It's just that he was always going to be available. They just felt like Ficklin had the better chance of giving Utah a chance to win. And so there's that. So with that said, either one of these quarterbacks will be available this Saturday. We won't fully know until it gets closer to the game. Kyle likes to keep these things close to the vest. But the point is he's available. And so there's that. Now, there's, you saw what Ficklin did against Colorado. And so you have to take some of that with a grain of salt. That's not to say Colorado is a terrible team. They're a good team, but they're just not the level of competition that Utah needs to judge themselves on to be able to say that Ficklin is the guy, right? And so, there was a lot of encouraging things there. Obviously, he threw for 140 yards, threw 2 touchdowns. He rushed for, 151 yards, if I remember right. So there was a lot of good that came from that game. And it's not that Ficklin isn't a great option there, but you're looking at a game that isn't going to really tell who Bird Ficklin can be, right? And as the saying goes, the most popular quarterback in the room is the backup quarterback, because it's real easy to be able to look at this and say, oh, well, he did this against that team. Well, there's a difference when the backup has to be schemed against, right? Where the teams know 100% that it's the guy, that they've got film on him, and that they can do different things to challenge them. Those things change. Colorado, they had a few plays where they could scheme up against Bird, but at the same time, they don't have a full game tape. And so there's not a lot that you can do to scheme around what he does specifically. But as the season goes, if Bird were to continue to play games, that becomes much harder for him because teams have now more tape on him and he can do that. It's pretty simple, nothing too dramatic there. But that's the nature of it, right? You see this all the time with QBs that step in and suddenly everybody's like, oh, why wasn't he starting? You saw that with Texas Tech, with Hammond jumping in. Then when teams could scheme against him and do better, he wasn't as efficient and as great. It's just the nature of how this game is played. So judge Bird Ficklin, off of these games, but at the same time, don't take it as the gospel truth that this is who he can be, right? You still have to see him against tougher competition. You still have to see him as he goes through each week as the guy. But with that said, there is a ton of composure. There's a lot of ability there. And, Kyle Whittingham called him unflappable and said that this is a guy that, the bright lights necessarily haven't been too bright for him. He's come in there and seemed composed and done well. I will say this last weekend that you saw a little bit more nerves than normal. In past games when he's gotten full quarters of reps, he could play loose because he knew that there was nothing at risk, nothing at jeopardy because you were up by a large margin. In this game, it really relied on him to be effective. And so there was a few of his throws, especially early on, where he was just putting too much juice on them. His touch wasn't there. And so you had some mistakes. But by and large, this is a quarterback that you can clearly see a lot of potential in what he does, in his true dual threat ability. And so I think, when you have two QBs like that, it gives you excitement. I know some people get this confusion that Dampier can't throw. That's not true at all, and he has been able to throw effectively. With that said, and I'm going to get into the stats here in a minute on what those are, it's not his main priority in the games that they've played, right? They've been able to do a lot in the run game, where he's a big part of that. You also have to factor in Utah's wide receivers. Do they have wide receivers that can be there for them? Devin Dampier has a great connection with Ryan Davis, but then beyond that, it's not that he doesn't have a connection, but there's other guys that could get there. Bird Ficklin has a pretty solid connection with Larry Simmons, and so it's just building different connections with different players, right? And so we'll see how that goes. But judging these two players on their own, if you grade them by their PFF grades, Devin Dampier is a 71.9 passing. Bird Ficklin is a 74.1 in passing. That's essentially the same. I don't think that there's a ton of difference there to be able to say, oh, well, Bird has a higher grade from PFF. That means he's clearly the better player. The reality is he's thrown the ball 22 times, and his last showing was just not great. Actually, he's thrown it more than 22s. That was just the game against Colorado. Sorry. It hasn't been much more. I think it was 9 passes before that, and he was 100% on those. But, he was 10 of 22 against Colorado for 140 yards. Yes, he had 2 touchdowns, but threw 45.5%. That's just not clearly good enough, and was able to move the ball. But a lot of that was the run game against Colorado. So you can't take a lot of that for what it's worth. I will say that we have seen Bird as a much better passer than what Colorado shows. So on the same vein, don't take that as an indication that he can't be a passer. I think he's clear. Well, I don't think. I know he's got a much better. He's got more zip on the ball than what Dampier does. Dampier has to lob it up a little bit more when he's going deep. But both of these QBs have been effective and efficient. So you're kind of, it is what it is. So looking at this a little bit deeper, I don't know why I'm going into this deeper because there's really no quarterback controversy this year. But that's not to say this couldn't happen, in a few months, especially when the offseason comes. You're going to have 2 QBs that are going to want to get paid. They're both going to want to play, and there may be a chance where Utah has to make a decision. Do they stick with Devin, or do they roll the dice with Bird Ficklin and go in on the next legacy and cut Devin loose if he wants to go somewhere else, right? Like, there's going to be decisions made. Josh Newman wrote an article for me today that was published as well, so you can go check that out on KSL.com. He kind of gives his take, excuse me, on the QB controversy and kind of what it all entails. So there's that. But looking real quick at just passing depth, I want to kind of get this looked at because there's been a lot of consternation, we'll say, about Devin Dampier's throwing. And it's a little bit overblown. Now, with that said, it's not perfect, right? Dampier is not the quarterback that's going to beat you with his arm per se. He has the ability to do it, but it's not in the same vein as a guy that is a true passer, right? He's leaning into the dual threat abilities and leaning more into the run, but he can be a passer. He's just not as gifted in terms of being able to make these deep throws or have that. That's not to say that he can't, but he's just not been able to showcase that here at Utah. Some of that is his receivers, quite honestly, and so you're going to judge that based off that. But just looking at this season, I'm not looking at New Mexico because, people get really funny with how looking at Mountain West games, whatever. Dampier does have the lowest, he has the lowest grade in the Big 12 on deep passes. On 25 attempts, he's got a grade of 29.1. Not great, right? It's not. He hasn't been able to connect very well on deep passes. Some of those, aren't fully his fault. Some of them are. Like I said, he lobs it up a little bit too much, puts a little too much air underneath it, and it hasn't worked as well. That's, once again, not to say that he can't. It's just not been really part of the arsenal either for Utah. And so on the ones that they have done, which they've tested those out a lot more early on in the season, they just haven't gone as well. But he can do it, right? Like, obviously that one to Jackson Benny in the Texas Tech game that got called back for a penalty, that was there, right? It wasn't fully on the money, but it was as close as you can possibly get without it being that. And so, like, there's potential there. It's just not something that's in his bag, right? Where Dampier works the best is in the intermediate game. And so he's the highest QB in the Big 12 in intermediate passing. He grades out at a 92.7, which anybody that doesn't know PFF grades, anything over a 90 is generally considered elite. It's not quite a one-to-one comparison there, but anything over 90 is considered elite. And he's done that on 48 passing attempts. Pretty solid. When you look at it, his standard passing there, so on all intermediate passes, he's passing at 60% there. But when you take out drops and maybe some other things that factored into that, PFF gives him an adjusted completion percentage of 68.8. So pretty solid that he's able to make these throws. This is where Dampier works, right? He's the short intermediate game. He's able to be efficient and effective in what he does, and that's been great for Utah. So there's not really a lot of worry there because he can be efficient in the passing game. It's just, this is how Utah's schemed it up. He's got Ryan Davis. He's got Dallin Bentley. Larry Simmons is really starting to come along. There's guys there that he can throw to. J.J. Buchanan is coming in there. All of those are intermediate routes, though. And there's not been a lot of big-time development, the 15, 20-plus yards trying to get there. Like, he can do it, but it's not been part of his arsenal. So, with Dampier, if this comes down to a scenario where you have to choose between the one, you have to decide on what's more valuable to you. Are you going to? Both of these have great talent running, and so you don't really. I don't want to say you don't want to factor that in because it does matter, but you're going to look at, like, what advantages do you get? Are you going to be more of a team that is going to focus on the intermediate passing? Are you going to try to develop more passing deep? Like, those types of things are going to be factored into that. When you look at Bird Ficklin, and granted, we really only have one full game to judge him on, but as the season, his deep passes, he grades out as an 80.4, which is clearly far better than Dampier. The problem is it's only on 4 attempts. Now, with that said, both of them have what the PFF calls big-time throws. These are just, throws that are game changers, essentially. They both have 2. And so they're equal there, but Dampier is doing it on a much higher rep count as opposed to Bird. And so there is potential there that you can get those deep passes with Bird. And so there's these little nuggets there where, when you talk about explosiveness and wanting to be able to be more explosive as an offense, which it is important, but I think it's more important on how you utilize the scheming within your offense. Explosives doesn't necessarily matter if you're, in like how Utah's utilizing it this year, where there's much more heavy dose of the run game, where that's been effective. If you want a more explosive quarterback, a guy that is going to have more deep shots, that seemingly has the arm and the cannon to do that, yeah, Bird is your guy. He's the guy that's going to throw those passes. We still have to see what that touch looks like in more reps. 4 reps isn't enough to judge a guy, but the progress there looks good, but it's not fully developed yet, and so it's tough to judge if that's, he's been great on those first 4 attempts, and then he's going to be terrible on the next 21. It's hard to know, right? And so you don't really have anything there. In the intermediate passing, he's graded out as an 84.1, so a little bit lower than Dampier, but he once again is only on 7 attempts. So there's just not a lot of work to be done here to see this. I mean, that's what, 11 snaps, 11 passing attempts that between deep and intermediate passes that you're judging a guy on. Like, you're not quite there yet, right? And Whittingham has talked about him being a much better passer than what Saturday showed, but you still don't know what you have. And so you're not going to see anything drastic change. You're not going to see Utah suddenly say, okay, we can win at a higher level now because Bird can throw the ball downfield. You don't fully know that yet. You don't know that against a tougher defense. You don't know a lot of things there. So as much as people want to talk about a QB controversy and Utah should just move over to Bird, it's not quite that easy, right? Like, you've got to be able to look at everything in totality and look at how this works. Utah's not looking to change its starting quarterback just on a whim. This is one of those things that they're going to spend a lot of time focusing on. And in the offseason, if both of these guys want to come back, assuming that they both want to come back and they're not, moving on or whatever that may be, then you can have this conversation. I still think Dampier, based off everything that he's done, would have the leg up, but I think Utah would be doing itself a disjustice if they weren't at least exploring the potential of having, both of these guys compete for the starting job. Now, that may seem like, a tough break for Dampier, but at the end of the day, it's all about trying to do the best with what you've got, right? And if Bird Ficklin is honestly the best option, then Utah has to go with it. If not, you're not doing yourself a good favor, right? And so either way, I mean, the funny thing here is we're talking about probably one of the first times in a while, at the very least, that Utah has 2 quarterbacks where they can feel really confident in winning. Dampier has clearly helped run an offense that is efficient. It's moving the ball really well, and a lot of that has to do with its offensive line, but they're doing it at a high rate and able to do it in a way that is getting Utah to be this high-scoring team, moving the ball with ease and getting it done. That's not to say Bird Ficklin can't do that, but you don't know what you fully have. And so don't fully buy into this yet. This is a conversation, honestly, that is more deeper into the season or the off season. Now, look, if Ficklin goes out there and he's the starter this week and he goes and beats Cincinnati and looks really good at it, then sure, maybe you can start having that conversation. I still think, Utah goes with Dampier, but I think if you're a marketed, how do I say it? If you're a much better player with Ficklin in a game like Saturday's, then yeah, maybe you do have to test it out. But I still think we're too early. We don't really have a large body of work here to be able to assess on. So, don't get any crazy ideas, but it's fun to look at the potential, also knowing that potential also can go both ways, because now Ficklin can, he's going to get money from other programs in the country. And barring him absolutely loving Utah or Utah paying high for him, there's not going to be a huge probability that he's going to want to stay as the backup to Dampier again, right? These guys want to play. Their time is limited. They want to be able to get to the league if that's their dream, which all of them, it's their dream. Like, this is where it's at. So, this is a question that I say is more hypothetical and more appropriate for the offseason, but that offseason comes quickly, and we'll see what happens. But I don't think Utah's also going to try to hide Bird Ficklin and try to make him somebody that, other teams can't see so that they can preserve him as a backup. I think they're going to do whatever they can to win, and if that means Bird, they're going to put him in. If that means Dampier, they're going to put him in. But there truly is no QB controversy. We put that to rest. Is that done yet? I don't know. We'll see. So, yeah, we're gonna put that to rest on this podcast. But I understand why people are talking about it, why it's a topic of conversation. It's a good topic of conversation in the sense that you should, have multiple good quarterbacks. Just in this era, in the transfer portal era, in the NIL era, it's much tougher to have two starting caliber quarterbacks. And we still don't know if Bird Ficklin is that guy, but you have to lend yourself to the side that he's probably going to be good. How good remains to be seen. All right, let's switch over. Let's switch gears a little bit, and we're going to go do the preview of the Cincinnati game. But first, let me tell you about our partners, Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump into the Cincinnati game. I'm going to get a little drink real quick. All right. Throat got a little dry. All right, so this game obviously kicks off at 8:15 on Saturday. The game will be on ESPN. It's the first ever meeting between these two teams, so interesting to have that kind of setting for this game where neither of these teams have played each other. But Cincinnati clearly has been a much improved team. They have great talent, and we'll get into that in a second. But this is a team that is doing really well with what they have. I think this is still kind of a bit early than what people expected, but there was clearly a kind of a feel around Cincinnati that they could be solid. Like I said, I still think it's a bit early from what people were expecting, but Cincinnati is by no means kind of outside of the realm of what they could have been. Now, with this game, you get the ESPN College Game Day coming to town, and I know that there's hesitations with this, right? For whatever reason, whenever there's a big game, aka College Game Day or Big Noon Kickoff, which we've seen twice this year, Utah has generally laid an egg. Their record in games at home is 2-3. We don't need to rehash all of those because I know some of those are pretty triggering for fans. But they're also 2-6 all time in any College Game Day appearance. You could add, Big Noon Kickoff, and then you get it even worse. But it's not been great for Utah in these games. Now, this is what I wrote about today. You can go read about it a little bit more. But these games are going to be those tough games, right? These are games, I think all but one featured both teams ranked. So you've got, and I think most of them, Utah was the lower ranked team. So you're facing teams that are generally better, or at least perceived to be better, and have momentum on their side as well. That doesn't, how do I say, like the game itself, like bringing College Game Day to town doesn't force a team to lose, right? Now, there can be more hype around it. There can be more attention, and so players kind of tense up and get tight because, they can feel kind of the college football universe swarming in around them. But at the end of the day, these guys are not paying attention to this. They're not focused on what people are saying in that. That's not to say that they don't hear things or that they don't understand what College Game Day means. I mean, I think anybody that's a fan of college football has watched College Game Day at least once in their life. Like, they understand it, and they understand the importance of it and what it could be. But at the same time, this game, bringing this type of a setting doesn't mean that suddenly Utah loses. What it means is that Utah just hasn't shown up in games that are tough. And the biggest ones that, there's two games, TCU and Oregon. Clearly, that Utah just didn't show up, but that had nothing to do with College Game Day. The one against Oregon most recently, Utah was kind of walking a tightrope with Bryson Barnes as its starting quarterback. Things were working, but it wasn't great, and Oregon was just clearly a much better team. Honestly, that season was what propelled Oregon into kind of the depths and levels that they are now. Dan Lanning was, new at coaching at Oregon, and everything was just kind of clicking. And so you went up against a team that now looks like a world beater. They're considered one of these teams that is an instant blue blood, not instant, but you get what I'm saying. They have the money, they have the cachet, they've got all these types of things. And so you went up against a team like that. And Utah just was a damaged, broken team at that time, even though they were ranked. There was just, you're holding it on with duct tape, essentially. And you saw how that season finished. You go on to lose, in the Las Vegas Bowl. I mean, like, things just didn't work out, and it wasn't just because of that game. So there's other factors there. You can talk about the TCU game. I don't think anybody wants to talk about that one if you remember that one. But that one, Utah just got beat by a clearly better team. So, like, these are those scenarios, right? It's not based off of game day coming. It's based off of how the teams are playing. This is a game where, on paper, Utah is at very least equal with Cincinnati. Now, their record isn't, but that's not to say that Utah can't beat Cincinnati just because College game day is coming to town. So any notion of that, kind of remove that from your head. That's not how it is. Now, the biggest question there that comes to it is, does Utah change its game plan for these bigger games? That has much more validity in my mind. And I think that has something, that is the most concern is, as Kyle Whittingham treats these games one by one. He truly doesn't look ahead. He's not trying to chase different teams. That's not to say his players aren't, but he's not trying to chase this. At the same time, this game has gotten all their attention. It's essentially the game that if they can win this, their path to a Big 12 title is far more clear. Once again, as we talked about earlier, it's not guaranteed, but it's more clear. And so do you subconsciously do things that change that, or try to force things, or try to do things that aren't what are part of your normal routine that we've seen with Utah each week? There's clearly been a difference this year where when Utah is dialed in and playing aggressive and playing to their game plan, they've become one of the toughest teams to beat in the country. They're blowing out teams. Their smallest margin of victories by 25 points. But then in these two games that they lost, and they're different for different reasons, Utah has changed. And so that's the bigger fear than College game day coming to town. If Utah changes, not from just like a full schematics point, but more of like who their identity is, that's where the things go wrong. And so that's going to be the bigger question here is, what identity does Utah bring? Do they maintain the identity that they had against Colorado? That's not to say that they have to blitz every down and they don't have to do all these things, but are they maintaining their identity in how they approach the offense and how they approach the defense in all that stuff? If that's there, then this is a Utah team that can win. And then it doesn't matter that game day was there or that big noon kickoff was there. It matters on what team, excuse me. It matters on what team shows up. So we'll see. I think this one has the makings to be a good game for Utah. It's the lovely night game that everybody loves. Being able to get there, you get the environment, and admittedly it is, right? Like I've railed against night games more for my own sleep, but that's part of the job. It is what it is. It's just more personal preference. But it's true that at night, these games are much more electric. They just have a different vibe to it. The fans feel it. It's the dark mode game, blackout game, whatever you want to call it. They get the hand-painted helmets. It's the large circle and feather design. Everything is here to provide excitement and entertainment for this game. You get a good opponent that's coming in that has a dynamic, quarterback. They do a lot of good things, and so it has all the makings for a fun game. So let's jump into Texas Tech. Sorry, let's jump into Cincinnati and what they do. But we're gonna get another drink again. Talking a lot here. This is why I have guests. Then I can not talk so much. All right, let's get back to this. So, some of the biggest players to watch here is going to start off with Brendan Sorsby. This is Cincinnati's quarterback, and I've watched a handful of his games, and he's one of those quarterbacks that is a baller, right? And he's a guy that's going to do whatever he can to get his team to a win. And you're seeing it in how he plays. He's great under pressure. He's incredibly efficient in his passing. He's also a dual threat QB, and so he can beat you that way. I mean, he's clearly one of the best quarterbacks in the Big 12, and that's largely for why Cincinnati is winning. He's not the only reason, but it's largely for why Cincinnati is winning the way that they are, is because you can't break him in a lot of ways. Now, that's not to say that he's, this perfect quarterback and he's as good as some of the best that Utah have faced, but he is a really solid quarterback that is going to give Cincinnati a chance in every game they play. He's completing passes at 65%. He's thrown 20 touchdowns and only one interception, has almost thrown for 2,000 yards. I mean, he's pretty solid. Has also rushed for 425 yards and 7 touchdowns as the team's third leading rusher. He leads the Big 12 in passing. In Pro Football Focus, he's got a 90.9 grade. The closest is Noah Fafita at Arizona with an 85.9. He's the top offensive QB in the Big 12 with a total grade of 91.7. I mean, this is a guy that just is great to watch. So, there's going to be some struggles at trying to contain him, not just from his running ability, though that is, a challenge. He's an incredibly efficient passer, and he gets the ball out quickly. So this is where Utah has to be assignment sound. They have to make sure that they're on him and ready to go, because, missed assignments or missed alignments or whatever it may have you could be the difference in a big-time throw, or it could be him gashing you for yards. This is where it's going to be a challenge. Now, he's been much better against the zone than man-to-man defense, but it's I don't want to call it marginal, but it's not a ton, right? The way Utah plays has potential to give him fits, but that's assuming that Utah's defense plays assignment sound. If they do that, there's definitely potential here to get to Sorsby, but he's a guy that, is not, barring him making his own mistakes, he's a guy that just doesn't make a ton of mistakes. He's efficient, he's effective, and he knows exactly what it takes to run his offense. Now, part of that success, though, has been a dynamic run game. And I'm going to get into some of those stats here in a second, but they're a team similar to Utah that loves to emphasize the run. And if the run game is efficient and that's developed, they've been able to do so much better in what they do. And for much of that, their leading rusher, Evan Pryor, has been the star here. He's almost rushed for 500 yards, has 3 touchdowns, and done really well. The problem is he's out this week. And so you don't have the leading rusher there. How does that change, the game plan for Cincinnati? They're still going to emphasize the run. They've got their backup, Tyree Walker. He's got 466 yards, so he's not that far behind. He's got 4 touchdowns. Great talent. This is not something where Cincinnati's going to the depths of their running back room and saying we don't have anybody. It just means that they don't have kind of that 1-2 punch. And so this is still going to be a pretty solid development in the run game with Walker as well as Sorsby kind of running things. Beyond that, that's where it gets more tricky for them. They don't have a lot of established rushers beyond that, but that's more because of availability and opportunity. And so there's not to say that there aren't guys behind them, but these two, Pryor and Walker have clearly been the guys as well as Sorsby mixed in there as well. So, this is going to be a team that absolutely tries to establish the run, and if they can get that to work, that opens up the passing game for Sorsby to work, and he's done really well there, been incredibly efficient. With that, Cincinnati has 4 receivers. Their top receivers, they're all pretty much interchangeable in how they operate in terms of kind of production. So you've got Cyrus Allen, Caleb Goody, and Jeff Caldwell, who are your 3 wide receivers. Allen has 381 yards. Caldwell, as their lowest, is 337. They're pretty efficient. Allen has been great for touchdowns. He's got 9 touchdowns. The rest are kind of in there. And then you have a tight end in Joe Royer. He has 340 yards and 4 touchdowns. But these 4 receivers are pretty efficient and effective in what they do. They're great at intermediate to deep routes, and so there's a chance that Sorsby can beat you that way. This is something where you can't let them have an inch, or they're going to take it, and they're absolutely going to get those explosive plays. So it starts with the run, as we've talked about. This is very much so like a Utah team. It starts with the run, and if that's effective, then it opens up that passing game, and they've been efficient and effective, and they've got multiple guys that can do it. They're not quite the same level as like a team like USC when Utah would play them, or Oregon, where, you lock down one and 3 other giant heads that are incredibly talented come up and can beat you. But that's not to say that this is not to that level as well, right? They're not quite to that level, but they're also really talented in what they do, and so it's going to be a real challenge for Utah in how they operate and in what they do here. So being assignment sound is going to be the name of the game here. I mean, that's the name of the game every week, but you get what I'm trying to say here, where you've got something where they can beat you in both games, passing and running, and the more you can limit one area of that game, the better it is for Utah. But if they can establish the run and establish the pass, this is going to be a really tough game for Utah. Now, looking at some of the stats, I don't want to bore you. We're getting to the near the end of this episode. We're just going to jump into a lot of this, and, it's really fascinating to me. It's fascinating because this is really going to come down to trench play. And I feel like I say this a lot, and it's not every single game, but a lot of these bigger games, trench play is kind of where Utah gets its edge. And when you play a team that is similarly skilled on the offensive side, not quite to the level that Utah is, but when they're skilled and able to be efficient in what they do, that presents a challenge. And so you get to see those matchups between the offensive and defensive lines. And this is one where when you're comparing offenses, Utah and Cincinnati are relatively close, right? Like one team will have an advantage in one area where the other has the advantage in the other. When you look at the defenses, though, this is clearly where Cincinnati is vulnerable. And it's not that they don't have a good defensive line. It's just not to the level of Utah's as well as some of the others in the Big 12. And so this is where if there's a struggle for Cincinnati, who is not favored in this game, they're a 10-point underdog, 10.5-point underdog, depending on where you're looking. This is to me the biggest storyline. You can talk about, Evan Pryor being out and that having a factor, and it 100% factors into this game. But before he was even ruled out, this spread was at 8.5. It was 6.5. I think it started out 8.5. It's moved up pretty quickly. But before all that happened, Utah was still favored here. And a lot of that, I believe, this is my own belief, that it comes down to Cincinnati's defensive line. Now, when I say that, you still have to have Utah that's executing its game plan, right? You have to be able to develop those things, and if they don't, then clearly those things get thrown out the window. These are just a judge to get into this game. But I think when you look at that, if all things are equal, Utah can win this game based off of Cincinnati's defensive line, assuming that it's all the same, right? And I say that because both of these teams are pretty efficient in what they do on the offensive side of the ball. For example, scoring, Cincinnati averages 38.3, Utah 38.9. Both of these are in the top 15, pretty solid. Their defenses are similar in limiting teams in scoring. Utah's just a little bit better at 14.3 for 9th in the country, and Cincinnati at 19.0 for 28th in the country. But both of these teams are pretty solid at limiting teams from scoring. Passing, they're pretty similar. Cincinnati has a little bit more of the advantage there, but it's not much. Defensively, Utah's defense is much better at the pass defense. They rank 7th in the country. Rushing, both of these teams are pretty solid in that, except for, Cincinnati's run defense is 67th in the country, whereas Utah's rush offense is 4th. And so, how does that work? But the big question here is in the red zone, where Cincinnati is an incredible 97.1% in the red zone this year. That's 4th in the country. And of those, 76.5% of that is touchdowns. When you look at Utah, their biggest area of weakness here is going to be allowing them to get into the red zone, because they've given up 86.7% of scores when a team gets into the red zone, and 60% of those have been touchdowns. So for a team that is incredibly efficient in the red zone, Utah has not been as good as stopping them, especially in touchdowns. So if they can get them outside of the red zone, that's obviously going to be the first step in being able to keep Cincinnati from not winning this game. But if they get there, this is going to be a true test and see what happens. Now, going more into the trench play, when you look at a lot of these things, so success rate, for example, this has been a big measure for Utah all season. We've talked about it a lot. They're one of the best teams in the country in success rate, being able to get the necessary yards that they need to when they need to. And Cincinnati's been even better. So, for example, Cincinnati's success rate is 51.5%. That's 7th in the country. Utah's has dropped a tiny bit at 49.6% at 14th, but still pretty solid. The real danger here for Cincinnati, though, is their defense is giving up 43.8% success rate as opposed to Utah 34.9%. So teams have been able to be much more successful against Cincinnati than others, right? Like Utah ranks 11th, whereas Cincinnati ranks 110th. Like this is a clear divide there. This carries over, though, in a lot of these three other metrics that I want to point out, and that is line yards, stuff rate, and havoc plays. Cincinnati, once again, rivals Utah in line yards. They actually beat Utah, where they averaged 3.71 yards per game. Utah's at 3.6. A lot of that's going to be their running backs being efficient and effective there. But both of these teams really solid with their line yards, the offensive line getting pushed, that kind of stuff. But once again, defensively, Cincinnati ranks 131st. They're giving up 3.31 yards. So you pair that with what Utah does and what Cincinnati's giving up, and that's a huge opportunity for Utah if things work out that way. Utah, conversely, is only allowing 2.42, which is 25th in the country, excuse me. And so, if they remain firm, they're okay. Now, I say all these things. I've got two more, but I say all these things assuming that that's how it works. Like, Utah can come in with a different game plan. Cincinnati can come in with a different game plan. Just because your averages are that or what you've done doesn't foretell everything, right? Let's just hope to make that clear. Now, looking at stuff rate. Stuff rate obviously is where you've stopped a team behind the line of scrimmage or at the line of scrimmage. Cincinnati's defense, once again, is giving up they're at 13.9%, which is 127th in the country, whereas Utah's defense is 22.9%. So that's how many percent, that's the percentage of plays that Utah is stuffing an opposing team. So 1 in 4 plays Utah's stopping a team behind the line of scrimmage or at the line of scrimmage. For Cincinnati, it's only about 14%. Clearly a big difference there. Both of these teams have been efficient in allowing stuff rate, so Utah doesn't allow much. It's only 12.2% of their plays. Cincinnati's a little higher at 15%. But when you look at that defense, it's really made, you see it more there where Utah has been much more effective on their defensive side as opposed to Cincinnati's. Lastly, havoc plays. On the defensive side, Cincinnati is creating havoc on about 14% of plays. That's good for 108th in the country, and Utah is at 17.8, which is 40th. So you've got a lot of these things where if Utah's defensive line can get into their backfield and make Brandon Sorsby, kind of pressured, that's going to give you a chance. But then conversely, on the offensive side of the ball, if Utah can establish the way that it has for the last few games, if they can keep that strategy or that formula, there's a real potential that you can do a lot of damage against this defensive line. Now, Cincinnati's going to come at this differently, right? Like, it's not going to say, well, guys, we haven't been effective all year, we're never going to be effective. No, there's nuances to this. But when you look at it, that's where the opportunity is. I'm just looking at stats to be able to say, here's where some of the opportunity is. And if Utah can win that battle, they're going to have a far higher likelihood of succeeding and winning a game. Still all has to play together, and it still has to come together, and Utah still has to play that aggressive style. They've got to convert. They've got to, make sound assignments. They've got to not be penalized, which has been a big problem for this team. There's a lot of those things that factor into this. But just on its surface, if Utah can, attack that defensive line and not allow them to set the tone as we've seen against Texas Tech or BYU, Utah's in a far higher likelihood of winning this game. So, that's kind of a quick look at that. I don't want to jump into it too heavily. We're at the end of this episode now, but I think that's really the keys to this game. If you can find an effective trench play, most readily available at the Utah offensive line versus Cincinnati's defensive line, there's a higher probability that Utah wins this. So really looking forward to see this game. Should be a lot of fun. Hopefully you have a great time going to College game day, that the night is great for you as well. And we'll come back next week and chat about how this all shook out and see if Utah still has a chance of getting into the Big 12 title game, or if this is another game where we come back and say, why can't Utah win the big games after destroying everybody else? So we'll see you next week. Hopefully you have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you later.